Hello, my name is Florian Thalhofer. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce Alisa Lebow. We know each other for a long time, but I never used your last name. Alisa is a documentary filmmaker, scholar, and writer. She holds a doctorate in cinema studies from New York University. She made many documentary films dating back to 1994 and has written extensively on first-person film as a practice of identity production imbricated by culture and ideology. She works at the intersection between practice and theory, and her project, Filming Revolution, won the Anne Friedberg Award for Innovation in Scholarship in 2020. Alisa does not believe that telling more and better stories will save us. Together with Alexandra Juhas, she is the author of the Beyond Story Manifesto that argues against the seemingly unstoppable story stream. Our first paths crossed in 2010 at Documentary Now in London, a conference Alisa had co-organized and that had a panel on interactive docs, which was rare at that time. I was invited to give a talk, and if I remember right, it was Alisa who introduced me. And I don't remember what she actually said. I always found introductions a torture, using complicated words, and because I was always super nervous and could not wait to deliver my talk and have a beer afterwards. At this Documentary Now conference, I also met Sandra Gaudenzi for the first time, who interviewed me for her PhD about a project that I had done many years earlier and that I considered to be totally outdated. But more interesting than that, there are the many other connections that started to grow in these 2 cold days in January in London. I recently learned that it was at Documentary Now that Sandra Gaudenzi and Judith Aston, who is also with us, here met for the first time. Judith approached Sandra with the idea to set up a symposium exclusively on interactive documentary, the first of its kind. That then became IDOCS 2011 and all the IDOCS conferences since then. And I would say that it also led to this conference today with a lot of, at the time, unlikely, random, and seemingly chaotic dots in between. At IDOCS 2016, Alisa presented her mind-blowing Filming Revolution project that not just blew my mind, but also that of Adrian Miles, a scholar from Australia, who sadly and tragically passed away since. I remember that Alisa got into a heated discussion with Adrian, based on what might been a misunderstanding, perhaps due to the complicated language Adrian liked to use. This kind of heated discussion subsequently led into a beautiful paper by Adrian Miles called I Am Sorry I Don't Have a Story, which I now read as a declaration of love to Alisa, the concept of filming revolution, and the thinking behind it. We will meet Adrian again later when I introduce Franziska Weidle, our next speaker. But to close this circle now, I would like to come back to Judith Aston. Judith is now not only part of our research network here in Lucerne, she's also, I have the great privilege that she's also the supervisor of my PhD together with Florian Krautkrämer, with whom we would also not be here today. So one could make the argument that Alisa Lebow.
Go ahead. I mispronounce yours all the time.
So one could make the argument that Alisa was at the start of it all. And this seems to be a good reason to start the circle of talks for this conference with her.
When I first heard about interactive documentary and was really in its nascent stages in 2007, nothing actually worked, by the way. Almost nothing worked that you tried. You know, you inevitably had the wrong browser or the wrong computer or the wrong, I don't know, electrical connection, but nothing ever worked back then. But it was still absolutely fascinating to me, and I was certain, maybe maybe correctly looking at this group, but maybe incorrectly, we'll see that this was an important aspect of the future of documentary. So Documentary Now was looking at the future of documentary, or what's happening in the present, that is exciting and interesting, and I think it's no coincidence that the two things I had identified as the most important new developments were in the world of art, that had recently discovered documentary anew, and an interactive documentary, and I think it really has borne out to be some of the most interesting work around. I chose to talk today about the intersection between interactive documentary and documentary studies, because I think so much of the energy and theorizing and interest, really, for good reason, in interactive documentary has to do with where it sits in the field of practice, in the field of filmmaking. So people are thinking in terms of general audiences, they're thinking in terms of festivals, they're thinking in terms of where film goes or where interactive documentary goes in lieu of, let's say, the theatrical. But there is this sort of, I'm speaking about a kind of side corner, but an important one nonetheless, of interactive documentary, and if it doesn't affect you or interest you, then, just put it in your pocket for later. Maybe there'll be something in there. But basically, I wanted to kind of create a little bit of space to think about what has come to also be called interactive scholarly work, ISW, and kind of what the specifics are for that kind of corner of the field. I don't know why this just skipped entire slides, so let's go back here. Random slide for my first introduction to interactivity, which was a 1963 novel translated into English in '66 by Julio Cortázar, which you were meant to engage with in any order, and was published by some publishers in kind of a stack of cards, so you could really just pick and choose where you went in. That's a description of somebody's experience engaging with this novel, but it is random, so I just like the graphics, really. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about my own practice in relation to the IDoc, rethinking, in some sense, not only the documentary or the very idea of the documentary, but also scholarship, how we do or might do scholarship, in my case, film studies. And I think probably it's fair to say the uptake of these kind of technological affordances in the field of scholarship that is not entering the academia, or not entering academia strictly as a practitioner, but mainly as a scholar, has not really been taken up quite in the enthusiastic way we might have hoped, but maybe the story is not over yet, speaking of stories. So when I set out to make an interactive project, I didn't set out to make necessarily a piece that would be shown in the interactive fora of the festival. I set out to do something in lieu of writing a book, essentially, right? My next step would have logically, in the kind of order of an academic career, to write a second book, and I absolutely did not want to do that. So I was already intrigued by interactive documentary, and essentially an opportunity arose that I could not pass up, but we will get to that in a moment. What I was thinking, though, at the time, was that why are we doing film studies in the old-fashioned way, right? If films are online, we can also start in making interactive work in relation to that material. We can generate new material also in that scenario. Why not update our approach to film studies? It felt sort of inexorable. It was inevitable. Why not do it? Why restrict ourselves to the page? And in fact, we have seen a tremendous advance in terms of criticism, a film criticism with the video essay, and in fact, it's even become an alternative form of assessment of our students, right? We can encourage them to make a video essay instead of writing a traditional paper. So yeah, I was endlessly sort of prodding my field, my colleagues, as to kind of why don't we also adapt and take on this opportunity. So I'm not going to go into the background of when I clocked interactive documentary and why. I think Florian actually did a good job of that, so that'll save us a few minutes, I think, here. But then come the wave of uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa. We could date it with Iran in 2009, or we can kind of date it a little later, 2010, 2011, which really sparked my imagination. I had already been studying the influence of uprising on film and film on uprising, and the history of revolutionary cinema, which goes back obviously to the Russian Revolution and the Soviets. And I had never really thought that I would encounter a moment in my lifetime when we would actually see people kind of working to create, in some sense, film appropriate to the time, and also film that can contribute to this kind of radical change. So I started curating films, as I work with a variety of film festivals. This was the Istanbul Film Festival. Every festival in 2012 had some program on what they were calling the Arab Spring, which we did not call the Arab Spring for reasons that I can go into later. But actually we decided to do it differently, and we programmed some contemporary work from Tunisia, Egypt, and also Iran. But we paired it with historical work, because the idea was, how can we also feed and give some energy to the makers who are really working in the midst of uprising? Everybody is mining them, this very extractivist move. I mean, when else have you heard of Cannes calling Egyptian filmmakers and saying, do you have anything for us? It's a first and a last, probably. But we decided we needed to do it differently, and I had this idea that we could actually do this massive project that would involve revolutionary film from the past. We would have whole projects on the Soviet cinema and Cuban cinema and Mozambican cinema. We could also do the present, right? So we could do a kind of deep dive historically, but also kind of more of a horizontal or lateral dive. And really, my project, Filming Revolution, was kind of meant to be the prototype. We've sort of stopped at the prototype for very clear reasons of funding. No mystery there. When I understood the limitations of, curating films for festivals, and I imagined that this could be a much more ambitious interactive project, very much responding to the moment in which it was happening, I also had to confront, let's say I focused my attention initially on Egypt, I had to confront the complexity or the chaos of what these events were and what it meant to represent them in any way. So any linear attempt to me felt literally like a misrepresentation. There's just no way to manage in a kind of neat package, and actually we've seen many films that have attempted, and they all, I think, essentially fail. I certainly couldn't position myself in relation to this material and to these events as an expert, not being Egyptian, not being part of the uprising, not being one of the media activists doing the work or the filmmakers working in that context, not speaking Arabic. Right, there was absolutely no way I could position myself as an expert in relation to this material, and I needed to sort of devise a way to do this kind of research without needing to position myself as such, right? A way of engaging with people literally in a lateral direction, horizontal rather than hierarchical. I felt that my task was in some sense to figure out the platform, to create a platform where certain kinds of conversations could happen that wouldn't be happening necessarily on the ground, and my task felt, in a sense, more curatorial than directorial. I think probably I wouldn't have been able to have access to these conversations with people if I didn't also have a past as a video activist, if I didn't also kind of have a sense of what it meant to take a camera to represent certain types of events. And I approached filmmakers in a sense as fellow thinkers, as fellow theorists. Not in any sense as subjects of the project. It was, in some sense, an opportunity to think together. And I think the questions that I was asking, they had all done a million interviews with, let's say, Western researchers or journalists, but the kinds of questions I was asking had not been asked of them before, and I think that was also, in some sense, refreshing, also maybe a relief at that point. So I also hope that the platform itself, if I was able to conceive of it, or at least create it as I had conceived of it, would allow for different kinds of ideas to rub up against one another. So it didn't need to kind of cohere. I didn't need everybody to agree on a certain approach or a way of thinking. It allowed for certain kinds of frictions to emerge, for the differences of approaches to emerge. I thought of it as a kind of dynamic platform. In terms of editing, because part of the concern of this conference has to do with how the practice changed us or our practice changed, I can't think of a more tedious editing process. Essentially, I wasn't editing in the way you would edit a linear project where you're sort of creating meaning. That's where the really exciting work of filmmaking happens, and you come up with these juxtapositions that really change how one sees the material or somehow expands it in certain ways. The editing itself was really about getting rid of the uhs and the ums or the repetitions in a given statement, because I was trying to intervene as little as possible in that process and sort of present an archive for people to engage with. I'm not going to go in too much depth into why interactive. All of the reasons that anybody would have given for making an interactive film were similar to why I was interested in interactivity, ceding a certain degree of authorial control, working on the level of non-narrative, really kind of expounding and expanding upon sort of the resonance of possibilities, creating and presenting an archive, a database for research. There's something exciting, I think, from an academic or a scholar's perspective where you're expanding your work outside of the sort of firewall of academia, maybe possibly speaking to a broader audience, potentially. But I was also particularly interested in creating a powerful research tool, which was very significant in a distinction that I needed to make in the way we programmed or created this project. It was very much with research or a research tool in mind. So in the midst of making this project, I was tapped by the organizers of Visible Evidence 2021 in 2014 to give a plenary talk about Filming Revolution, about doing documentary studies interactively. I think I quaintly called it Documentary Studies 2.0 at the time. Forgive me, it was 10 years ago. And here is us. Okay, the project was supposed to have been finished by then, but of course, anybody who has made an interactive project knows it takes much longer than you think. We were at a point of crisis, actually, by the time I was giving a plenary talk in 2014, where I simply could not get the designers to understand that I didn't want it to look like a bubblegum popcorn kind of project, that we're talking about serious issues here. We ended up, after my presentation in Visible Evidence, actually firing the designer and getting an entirely new designer. That was genius and very late. But here we are, at a documentary studies conference, the preeminent international documentary studies conference, Visible Evidence in New Delhi, and there I am flanked with 7 or 8 technicians just trying to get this project up and running so that I can show something of what we're talking about. You can see me in one of these. I had long hair there, right? The white shirt. But I'm completely obscured by the number of people around just trying to make this thing fly. So, why hasn't this taken off in academia? Is it kind of, certainly technology is one of the stumbling blocks. Not to mention the fact that most of the people I was talking to in the room had no background or experience making work, and I think it has remained actually quite intimidating as a prospect technologically. Nearly 10 years later, my Filming Revolution project remains one of actually a relatively small number of interactive scholarly works, ISWs, that have kind of entered into that imprimatur of academic publishing, as it were, which, I'm talking to many people in the room who are in academia and have had to fight the good fight to convince their panels, let's say promotion panels or their deans or whomever, that their practical work is scholarly work. And I am absolutely not denying that it is. But the way in which filmmakers and interactive projects do that is by having their premiere, being able to say they had their premieres at festivals, being able to kind of garner film reviews, critical engagements, etc. The way in which somebody coming in from the kind of more traditional scholarly angle, the way in which we need to be able to convince the various powers that be in our realm has pretty much still traditional criteria, and so that became, we began to be looking toward publishing as one of the main imprimatur for kind of academic recognition. So I would say, why has documentary studies 2.0 not fully taken off, or film studies 2.0 not fully taken off? I'm not sounding the death knell. I think that it is still possible, but certainly the biggest stumbling block is funding. There's no way about it. I'm happy to answer questions about my own funding, but if there are any Canadians in the room, you should take your heart medicine when you learn how low my budget was. Right, it's very, very difficult to actually access academic funding for this kind of work, and writing an article or a book might mean, the time off one needs to do their research, but it doesn't mean also thousands more in funding the sort of technical aspect. So I think another stumbling block is this uncertainty of the status of the output. And I will eventually get to this question of publishing, which I think maybe I have some, some insight into. So obviously there are huge similarities between, let's say, the interactive scholarly work and the IDoc. As everybody has said, there is no one thing called an IDoc. This is a multiple and ever-changing field, and certainly the research and the rigor that goes into them is absolutely the same. I don't think there are any major distinctions we're going to make there. There's all kinds of other issues and concerns. I'd say concerns under, for example, the last 2, last 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Anyway, there are major issues, stumbling blocks, issues, problems. But funding, for example, as difficult as it may be for a creative project, it very much still, exists. There are avenues for funding an interactive documentary that aren't necessarily appropriate, don't necessarily fit well with the ISW. One of the main issues for doing interactive scholarly work is searchability, which all the off-the-shelf programs at the time when I was stepping into the field early, 2012, let's say, really didn't have that functionality. That was a major issue. The privileging of information over experience, I think, is something that we tend to maybe understate a little bit, but I think it's actually quite relevant for the ISW, driven by ideas more than stories, hence my intervention at IDOCS in 2016. I had actually looked at all the funding possibilities for my project, and pretty much all of them were talking about the experiential, all of them were talking about the story, about character-led, about, you know, a certain level of immersion that was sort of expected. All of these kind of were secondary concerns for me, and it didn't really fit. It was a bit of a square peg in a round hole, or vice versa. I'm going to touch now on just the last two elements, the attention span question and that of scholarly recognition, which ends up being quite a major, if, you know, very particular and slightly ridiculous concern. So in terms of attention span, I kept arguing that, you know, my project didn't need to be seen by millions, and you know, I wouldn't expect a book on a similar subject that I wrote for kind of academic purposes to be a bestseller. I would expect a much more in-depth engagement. So the idea is anybody who's willing to read a challenging scholarly text, ideally not written in impossible terms, but nonetheless, it's that same person who would be willing to engage with a project that I was making. And of course, you know, we all have habits now developed through our internet experiences. We're all kind of surfers and clickers, and, you know, we all have some form of ADD in relation to the habits we've developed. But at the same time, I was very gratified to encounter Roderick Coover's argument about the accepted wisdom being that, you know, everybody on the internet has a 3 to 5 second attention span, and that you have to really pander to them. So for Coover, well, he was basically saying exactly what I had been arguing as well. So it's always great to be affirmed that the works which challenge the easy consumption of ideas may require time and effort on the part of the receiver, just as they probably did, or certainly did, on the part of the maker. So the viewer or the user or the viewer or whatever we call them of interactive scholarly work is essentially that same person who's willing to sort of wrestle through a text, or at least we hope they are. And although all of us have developed other, you know, 3 to 5 second attention spans, you know, we hope to catch them on a better day, essentially. So I think that's actually a very different kind of expectation, and one that we actually really needed to sort of assert or articulate, because it's sort of operating in a slightly different, or at least a corner of the field. So I had mentioned things about searchability, I had mentioned things about attention span. Here I'm also mentioning something about, in some sense, the academic or scholarly imprimatur. Here we have Filming Revolution in its newer incarnation, because I had published it all by myself in 2015, but in 2018, a sort of recast version, somewhat updated, was published by Stanford University Press in their new digital arm, and it even got an ISBN from Stanford University Press, which is really an imprimatur that really only books prior to this initiative had been able to receive. So how did this happen? Probably many of you know what it feels like to launch an interactive project on your own. You launch it into the ether, it disappears into the gazillion projects that are there. If you're not on an already recognized platform, absolutely nobody is looking for it. So I feel that I launched that project at least 20 times. It's akin to coming out, you know, it never ends. You're just endlessly going to be coming out again, to the taxi driver, to the dry cleaner. It's like that. Like, I launched my project a gazillion times, and it was new every single time. And you never know where you're launching it. So I did a one-day workshop at Cambridge. They had a digital center, and it just so happens that the person running the digital center at Cambridge had written actually extensively on the Egyptian Revolution, so she was particularly taken by the project. And when Stanford Digital got their first funding from the Mellon Foundation, which was over $1 million, they were looking for projects. When does Stanford University Press ever look for projects? It's a little bit like Khan knocking on the door of Egyptian filmmakers. And who do they go to? They go to Cambridge, right? They go to Harvard. And they happened to ask the person running the digital center, Anne Alexander, if she knew of any projects that might be ready, up and running, that they could consider for their earliest publications. So she is sort of single-handedly responsible for Stanford coming to me. I didn't even know it existed, right? But the major concern of a work like this is obsolescence, right? Sooner or later, your technology is going to go the way of the dodo bird, who referred to it as the cinematic cemetery, right? Clicking on projects that you saw just a few months ago and that are no longer working, and a kind of invisibility, right? So I had not future-proofed my project at all, hadn't really even thought about it, had no idea what was going to happen in a few years when it just wouldn't work anymore. And so Stanford actually was interesting to me, not because I was really so aware of the academic imprimatur, because what is Stanford Digital anyway, but because they were talking about archiving. And I thought, oh my God, you know, as they would say in Egypt, I have back. Somebody is behind me taking care of this if I go with Stanford. And I said, are you really interested in this? They had a prototype on their website that really just looked like, you know, a book that you could click on and see a picture, right? And I thought, you know, I don't know, if you're looking for projects like that, I don't think you're going to be interested in my project. But if you want something to really explode the very idea of the book, maybe, you know, maybe we can talk, because I was prepared for them to just say no. But this archiving, the promise of archiving was incredibly attractive to me, because I had really no resources and no way to think about how this project might survive. And I mean, one of the things about the book, in fact, Stanford University Press's motto is ideas that matter, books that endure. Right? The book. Right? Okay, sometimes every once in a while they disappear, but mainly they maybe just go out of print, but you can always find them somehow, somewhere, and these kinds of projects just not enduring, right? And I actually was I was part of they actually had no idea how they were going to archive their projects, and they invited some of their early project makers along with a whole bunch of archivists and some brilliant programmers to figure out how to archive these programs. So they put a tremendous amount of their resource. At the end of the day, Mellon Foundation funded them to the tune of almost $2.5 million, but their funding has just run out, or actually in December. So Stanford Digital, which not only innovated ways of archiving these projects, ways of kind of treating them as, you know, exactly the same as a book, creating rigorous peer review processes, et cetera, and giving, obviously, their academic imprimatur to a project, to a program. They basically could not figure out a model for sustainability. Now, of course, academic presses do not sustain themselves. Famously, they are funded by others. But they do, you know, they make some money, they sell books. And so it's just, you know, the sort of the stopgap of the budget that a university will be filling in. I don't know if anybody paid any attention in 2019 when the provost of Stanford University basically said, Stanford University Press can go to hell if they can't meet their $7 million budget. We are not going to give them the $1.7 million to fill in their gap. The oldest university press in the US, one of the most esteemed, was basically being told that if they didn't have a proper economic model, they can go to hell. And just to put it into perspective, it's 0.03 of the operating budget of Stanford. That's something like if a family lives on, I don't know, what is it? It's like $30 dinner for a $1,000 budget, right? Or maybe even a $10,000 budget. I don't even remember the facts, but it's a tiny amount. It makes no difference to them whether they give that money or they don't give that money. But Stanford Digital was about to add a few million to the budget a year. So while Stanford University Press is fighting for its life, they basically cut the expensive arm of their operation off. If Mellon's not going to continue to fund it, which of course they had never promised to do, then no more Stanford Digital. So you have Stanford Digital having taken on 17 projects in 7 years. Many, many fewer than the book arm of the publisher. And they're not taking on any new contracts. So does this signal the death knell? I don't really know the answer to that. When I spoke with the editor and the archivist of Stanford Digital, one of whom has moved on already, and the other of whom basically loses her job in December, they were bizarrely hopeful. They feel that they have sort of opened up inroads and that others will follow. Brown University is doing some projects in conjunction with MIT, I understand, and there's still a few initiatives, but there's nothing. I mean, Stanford Digital was kind of meant to be the trailblazer, the groundbreaker, and one expected, just as I expected more documentary studies or film studies 2.0 to follow my lead, and I looked back and there weren't very many following. I think Stanford Digital found itself in a similar situation. It is too early to signal the final demise of these scholarly interactive projects. Maybe they should go the way of the dodo bird, I don't know. But I've recently been approached by 3 Indian scholars working at NYU Abu Dhabi who knew about my project and have asked me to consult on their interactive project about Indian women filmmakers. And I do also know of another project. I'm sure there are people in the room who can tell me about many, many more projects that I don't know about, but I know of one that sort of looked under the hood of my Filming Revolution project to understand something of the coding. I'm sure it's a complete homemade airplane behind the scenes, so I don't know what they could have made of it. But there's a project hopefully still going on about revolutionary cinema in Cuba that has certainly taken some inspiration from this project. You know, if you ask me, would I do this again? I mean, a few months back, I basically said, no, I'm really happy going back to the quiet of writing, you know, my desk, and needing no resources and needing no kind of technology more complicated than, you know, Word documents. But actually, it's about circumstances. And if we were in a situation where funding, you know, was relatively more available, certainly with the aim of developing a software for these kind of scholarly particular needs that a scholarly project might have, I would actually jump at the chance. So it's not as if I am, you know, done with this possibility, but I think there are particular challenges in the sort of scholarly interactive world that are only looking kind of more increasingly difficult. So I leave on a bit of a down note, but I expect that we're going to be on a much higher note by even the end of today. So thank you. By the way, I do have a slide. You can kind of visit the projects that Stanford Digital has, and almost none of them are film related. And I think probably the closest to the one I was working on is the Anand Singh Feral Atlas project, which is a really beautiful and inscrutable project. Okay, that's it.